Hey everybody, I hope you're doing well today. Today's episode of the Thinking Tools podcast and newsletter from Sense of Mind is about the evolution of the gut's nervous system, biology's fundamental role in your emotional life and in human cultures, and other similar topics. All of this centers on a 2018 book called The Strange Order of Things: Life, Feeling, and the Making of Cultures by Antonio Damasio. As always, this episode has 5 parts: a fact about the brain, a happiness or productivity tip, a book recommendation, a thought-provoking quote, and my thoughts about life, culture, or current events. But before we jump into all that, would you mind giving this show a like and hitting subscribe if you're watching on YouTube, or giving it a 5-star rating if you're listening to the audio version as a podcast? Also, if you want the full video version of this podcast and all previous episodes, then you can sign up for free by going to senseofmindshow.com/newsletter. Every Friday, I'll send you a link for the video version of the most recent episode, as well as any news or other new videos from Sense of Mind. Okay, so thank you for being here. Let's get into part 1 of today's episode, which is the fact. This one has to do with the evolution of the nervous system in your gut. One way to ensure the death of any animal is to deprive it of oxygen, water, or food. While water serves as the surrounding media for all organs and even the organelles within cells, food and oxygen serve a more specific role. They provide the energy needed for anything the organism might do, including movement, cognition, or even breathing and digestion themselves. Thus, the organs responsible for respiration and digestion are fundamental to the life of the organism. And it's arguable that food is even more fundamental to living systems than oxygen because it's possible to generate chemical energy in the absence of oxygen, albeit in limited amounts, but not at all in the absence of food. It makes sense then that there's an extensive nervous system devoted to these organ systems and to digestion in particular. The 18th century Greek word enteron means intestine, and it provides the root of the term that scientists have given to this digestive brain, the enteric nervous system. Scientists sometimes refer to it as the second brain because it contains a few 100 million neurons, that's a lot, and it can function somewhat independently from the brain in the head. However, according to neuroscientist Antonio Damasio in this book, The Strange Order of Things, the enteric nervous system may be more accurately characterized as the first brain, not the second. What he means is that in the course of evolution, the enteric nervous system may have evolved before the head brain, possibly because of the fundamental nature of digestion that we just discussed. Now, this order of appearance may seem strange until you consider the central role of digestion for living organisms. Damasio notes that the process of digestion is not only indispensable, but also complex. It requires the coordination of a system of organs stretching from one end of the animal to the other. Coordination implies that something is doing the coordinating. In this case, it is no doubt the enteric nervous system, which senses the state of each organ, responds to what it just sensed, and then commands smooth muscles in organs to contract at the right times. Now, the head brain also plays a part, but there's evidence that it arose in evolution after the enteric brain. So for that kind of evidence, Damasio points to the cnidarians, which refer to the taxa of animals that include jellyfish. Now, cnidarians don't have a head brain, and they don't even have a head, but what they do have is what scientists call a nerve net. And Damasio notes that this may be the evolutionarily oldest form of nervous systems. Now, he explains that cnidarians appear earlier in the fossil record than flatworms, which are the first animals that can be confidently said to have a head brain, and a very simple one at that. Okay, so according to Damasio, at least 2 features of the cnidarian nerve nets suggest that they were the immediate precursors to the modern enteric nervous systems. The first is that they coordinate digestion, And the second is that they are anatomically quite similar to the network of nerves slotted between the layers of connective tissues and the muscles of the digestive system. That first feature, the coordination of digestion, may be more accurately described as the contraction of muscles that allow food to flow through and into the organism, which is really all that's required in terms of muscular actions, because once food is inside of a cnidarian's digestive system or just that cavity, it breaks it down into a mush, which can then be, the nutrients from which can then be absorbed directly. Now, from this perspective, it appears that the enteric nervous system may have a deeper origin in the history of life than the brain in the head. This perspective is one that prizes the maintenance of life, which makes sense given that without life, nervous systems would have nothing to evolve for. But digestion is just one piece of the puzzle of how to maintain life. It's a part of a suite of processes that together form a superordinate process that keeps all systems of the living organism in check and within acceptable ranges. That process is known as homeostasis. And you might not realize that homeostasis is largely responsible for how you feel, both physically and emotionally. And that leads me to part 2 of this episode, the tip. All right, so this week's tip is about why your feelings are at least partially a result of homeostasis, and why getting your health right will naturally allow your feelings to improve. Okay, outside of physical pain, it's our emotions, or more accurately, our feelings, which cause all of our suffering in life. Similarly, in addition to the rawest forms of pleasure, physical pleasure, like orgasms and the relief from pain, it's our feelings that constitute the greatest and deepest joys that we humans can experience. This week's tip is about a powerful strategy for improving the general tenor of your emotional feelings. But this raises a question. Where do feelings come from? According to Antonio Damasio in The Strange Order of Things, feelings are the result of the nervous system processing signals from the body, which indicate how far the various systems of the body are from homeostasis. He defines homeostasis as, quote, the fundamental set of operations at the core of life, from the earliest and long-vanished point of its beginning in early biochemistry to the present. It produces survival and is taken for granted. It ensures that life is regulated within a range that is not just compatible with survival, but also conducive to flourishing, to a protection of life into the future of an organism or species. Okay, that's a bit of a mouthful, but Damasio devotes an entire chapter to discussing the different definitions of homeostasis, so this is actually pretty brief in comparison. And it's also fairly comprehensive. Now, the point of all this is to say that feelings, even those feelings that come from the more cerebral processes of heartbreak or self-actualization, for example, are arising from homeostatic processes. In those more cerebral cases, it's more like the brain's prediction of homeostatic changes to come, rather than those present in the immediate here and now. Now, that may seem strange, but in reality, this is a subtle, nuanced, and powerful argument, which I'm not really able to fully recapitulate here, but which Damasio explains in chapter 7 of the book. Now, if we accept Damasio's idea, at least the weaker form of his argument, which states that our moment-to-moment well-being is strongly influenced by how well our bodies are achieving homeostasis, then we would be well advised to influence our homeostatic balance in a positive direction. This is the principle behind the idea that what you eat has a powerful effect on how you feel. For example, if you assault your gut with floods of sugary and alcoholic drinks on a regular basis, you will likely not feel as happy as you would if you opted for water instead. It's not just that you feel better about yourself for making that kind of healthy decision, though those kind of cognitive recognitions are definitely a part of the equation. Instead, it's the fact that your digestive, immune, nervous, and other bodily systems are suffering due to the sugar and alcohol molecules that tend to drive the cells of those systems into less optimal states. Similarly, when you exercise, you improve your health in a number of ways, which is reflected in your mind by a positive state. partly brought about by the release of endorphins that reduce pain in addition to other similar biochemical processes. Sleep is another fundamental physiological process without which you feel nothing short of terrible. And while the details of why sleep is so restorative are still being investigated by scientists, one process that it does facilitate is the cleaning up of waste in the brain and body, which is definitely a homeostatic process. Finally, while positive social relationships are perhaps less directly connected to general health, our species evolved to live in groups, and we depend on other humans for both our sanity and our physical well-being by providing both sustenance and protection from danger. So as I enumerate the many ways in which homeostasis affects our mental well-being, a broader role of homeostasis seems to appear, one that may explain many aspects of human social life, including culture itself. And this leads me to part 3 of this episode, the book. Now, of course, this week's book is The Strange Order of Things, Life, Feeling, and the Making of Cultures by the neuroscientist and neurologist Antonio Damasio. It's published in 2018. So the two ideas I have so far discussed hardly scratch the surface of the big picture ideas that Damasio paints in this lucidly written book. Surprisingly, it's only about 250 pages, and yet it presents a relatively unique view of the evolution of life, the nature of emotions and consciousness, and the origins of human cultures. I'll say more about Damasio's ideas about human cultures when I discuss the quote in the next section of this episode. But Damasio has been and continues to be a highly influential figure in neuroscience and psychology, especially in the areas of affect, feelings, and emotions. To be honest, to fully appreciate the ideas that he presents in this book, it requires a pretty careful reading, but it's rewarding both intellectually and aesthetically. While reading, it becomes clear that this book is the product of a mind that has been both fully immersed in the scientific literature and which is acutely aware of the more subtle aspects of the human condition, those that can only be gleaned by experience and introspection. I recommend this book not so much as a comprehensive view of the human brain, nor necessarily any of the other topics covered, but instead as a deeply engaging, careful, and beautifully informative, albeit brief, overview of what it means to be human. And that leads me to today's quote, which of course comes from this book. Quote, "All mental faculties intervene in the human cultural process, but in the last 5 chapters, I chose to highlight the ability to make images, affect, and consciousness, because cultural minds are not conceivable without such faculties. Memory, language, imagination, and reasoning are leading participants in cultural processes, but they require image making. As for the creative intelligence responsible for the actual practices and artifacts of cultures, it cannot operate without affect and consciousness." End quote. So as you can see, much of the book leads up to this discussion of the deepest roots of human cultural practices. Here, it may be important to issue a caveat that might not otherwise be apparent. Damasio is not saying that individual human cultural practices, including particular religions, economic systems, art forms, family traditions, and so forth, are baked into our DNA in the sense that there is, for example, a gene for Christianity or Thanksgiving dinner. Instead, he's suggesting that the roots of all these practices, the motivations for pursuing them and continuing them through the generations, are to be found in the biology of the human organism. It's not that all cultural practices are necessarily beneficial to health and well-being, but that their origins may be found in the pursuit of those goals. For example, perhaps the ubiquity and diversity of literature around the world is a reflection of our desire to simulate the lives of others in order to better understand and act in our own lives in a way that allows us to survive and flourish. Now, these benefits notwithstanding, it's certainly possible for certain books to do more damage than good. You can just think of, Hitler's Mein Kampf. But once again, I cannot fully regurgitate Damasio's argument in the time I have here. Just suffice it to say that far from being merely the creation of our giant human intellects, it appears that cultural practices and artifacts result in large part from our drive to survive and thrive in a world that is often hostile to such endeavors. And this finally leads me to part 5 of this episode, my thoughts. Here, I'll be brief. It seems to me that Damasio's perspective on the origins of human cultures suggests that we should be careful about tearing down our traditions in the name of progress. Now, the opinions I'm expressing here are my own, not necessarily Damasio's. Still, if his view is correct, then we must be extremely careful not to throw out the baby with the bathwater when it comes to social change. For example, it's plain to see that some religions have practices that harm their adherents. But to use those examples as justification for destroying, dismantling, or otherwise discarding religion or religious practices in general is misguided and likely to cause more harm than good. And this is coming from someone who is not religious and doesn't believe in God. Now, similarly, it's obvious that, for example, the U.S. Constitution is not a perfect document, and it requires amendments to be of maximal use in promoting the thriving of all Americans. But anyone who imagines that destroying it and starting from scratch will not produce enormous suffering disproportionate to any benefits that such a restart might possibly incur is lying to themselves. Now, one point that bears mentioning here is that while the benefits of traditions and institutions are not always obvious, the harms may be. Yet the benefits may, on balance, justify keeping those traditions or institutions in place. So, while it's undeniably true that we can and should try to improve society, and that such improvements require some degree of change, we must never be cavalier about ripping apart the foundations of society. In other words, cultures may have evolved to serve homeostatic needs. So we should be slow, that is to say, conservative, in deforming, dismantling, or discarding them. All right, well, that does it for today's episode. Thank you so much for watching and listening. And remember, if you want a full video version of the podcast, you can get every episode for free if you go to senseofmindshow.com/newsletter. By the way, I have a favor to ask. Will you give this podcast a 5-star rating wherever you listen to it? It really helps. And if you're on YouTube, like I was asking earlier, would you mind giving it a like and subscribing to this channel if you're not already? Thank you so much for your time. As always, this channel is brought to you by the Diamond Mind Foundation. This episode was written and produced by me, Andrew Cooper Sansone. Thank you so much for watching. I'll catch you next time.